It was a hot and humid night in Baton Rouge, the kind of night when the air feels heavier and every headlight reflects on the wet streets as if the city were sweating along with its inhabitants. Jamal Winslow was driving unhurriedly, enjoying the silence of the road after a long dinner with colleagues. The day had been intense at work, as always. As a United States Assistant Attorney, his routine was marked by hearings, investigations, and a constant battle with the gears of the judicial system. He knew better than anyone how certain things worked, or rather, how certain things were made to work against certain people. But there, alone in the car, he wasn't thinking about that. He was only thinking about getting home, maybe opening a book before sleeping. It was then that the red and blue lights flashed in his rear-view mirror. The sound of the siren cut through the road's tranquility, pulling Jamal back to reality with a familiar tightening in his stomach. He hadn't committed any infraction. Nothing. He instinctively checked the mirrors, the speedometers, the street around him. Everything was fine. Even so, he signaled and pulled over. His breathing remained controlled, but his mind had already started calculating the next steps. He knew exactly what to do, how to act, which words to choose. But above all, he knew the most important thing. When a man like him is pulled over late at night by police officers like these, the truth doesn't always matter. Jamal kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed in the rear-view mirror as the two officers got out of the car. The first, tall and broad-shouldered, adjusted his belt before slowly approaching. The second stayed by the patrol car, watching from a distance, his hand already resting on his holster. The protocol was clear, and Jamal knew it better than anyone. He rolled down the window, without any abrupt movements, and waited. "Good evening, sir. Do you know why we pulled you over?" The question came in a rehearsed tone, but Jamal noticed the empty expression behind it. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he waited for the officer to continue. "Your taillight is out. I need to see your license and vehicle registration." Jamal held the officer's gaze for a second longer than usual before speaking. "I'm sure my taillight is working, but of course, here are my documents." His tone was firm but controlled. He knew he couldn't give room for any misinterpretation. The officer took the documents without looking away. Next to him, the partner stepped closer. There was a weight in the air that Jamal recognized well, a game he knew too well. They were waiting for something, any hesitation, any slight misstep that would justify what they had already decided to do. "Get out of the car, sir." The order came without explanation, without any apparent reason. Jamal took a deep breath. "What is the legal justification for that, officer?" His voice remained calm, but he noticed the brief glance exchanged between the two officers. This wasn't a routine stop. It was a test. They wanted to see how far he would go, how much he would tolerate. "Get out of the car now," repeated the first, this time with a firmness bordering on threat. Jamal felt his pulse quicken, but his mind remained sharp. He knew that pattern well. First an approach without justification, then a deliberate escalation to make the victim lose control. That was how they manufactured charges, but he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. With his hands still on the wheel, he took a deep breath and repeated, "With all due respect, officer, I would like to know the legal reason for this order." The silence among the three lingered for a few seconds, laden with tension. The broad-shouldered officer clenched his jaw and leaned slightly forward. "Either you get out of the car now, or you'll be forcibly removed." This time, the threat was explicit. No cameras, no witnesses, just their word against his. And Jamal knew exactly how that kind of story usually ended. He had two options: comply and get out of the car, or resist and give them the perfect excuse. But the truth was, no matter what he chose, they had already decided how it would end. "I'm getting out," he announced, slowly opening the door without any sudden movements. His feet touched the hot asphalt as he stood up, his hands raised to show that he posed no threat. Even so, before he could say anything, he felt a violent tug on his arm. followed by the impact of his body being forced against the hood. The hot metal burned his skin through his shirt, and before he could react, he felt his wrists being tightly cuffed. "Resisting arrest," he heard one of them say, as if reading from a script. The other laughed quietly. "And obstruction as well." The words were empty, yet loaded with meaning. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter who he was. In that moment, Jamal Winslow was no longer the United States Assistant Attorney. He was just another man. The ride to the precinct was a stifling silence. Jamal felt the grip of the cuffs marking his skin, but he didn't react. There was no reason to react. He looked out the window, watching the streets blur by. As much as he tried to prepare himself mentally, something inside him churned. He had dealt with cases like this countless times before, sitting in a courtroom, dismantling flimsy arguments like the ones those officers would use against him. But now, he was on the other side. Now, he was the defendant. And worst of all, he knew that none of it was a mistake. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to. Upon arriving at the precinct, he was pushed out of the patrol car and taken inside without ceremony. They didn't ask for explanations, nor did they give him a chance to say anything. They simply followed the protocol of humiliation. Remove your shoes, empty your pockets, pose for a photo. The officer who cuffed him filled out the paperwork with the ease of someone who does it every day. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, obstruction. 3 charges that could mean a night in a cell or years of trouble, depending on how the system decided to play with your life. But Jamal wasn't only worried about himself. He thought of the faces he had seen at that precinct, the stories that never made it to a courtroom, the voices that were silenced before they had a chance to defend themselves. And he wondered, how many before him had gone through exactly the same thing and never come out? Jamal was taken to a small, cold cell where the smell of cheap disinfectant mingled with that of sweat and despair. The concrete bench against the wall was the only place to sit, and the thick bars cast distorted shadows on the floor. He spent the first few minutes analyzing the situation. He knew that outside, the gears of the system were already turning. The officers would file a report full of gaps and contradictions, but that didn't matter. They didn't need evidence. They just needed a judge willing to believe their word. And in Baton Rouge, that judge had a name and face: Margaret Holloway. Judge Holloway was not known for her patience, much less for her impartiality. She conducted trials as if they were mere formalities, a theater where the ending was already written. Jamal had seen her in action before. He knew how she operated, how she dismissed defenses, how she grew irritated when a lawyer insisted too much on something she had already decided to ignore. And now he would be the next before her. The irony of it all almost made him laugh. But there was no humor there. Just a cold pit in his stomach that he hadn't felt in years. Not because of what they would do to him. He knew he'd have an out. But because of what it signified. If he, a United States Assistant Attorney, was there, without a voice, without rights, without a chance, what happened to the others? Those who didn't have badges, contacts, or any hope of being heard? The hearing was set for the following morning, without any fuss, as if it were just another routine case. In court, Jamal sat in the defendant's chair, feeling the eyes on him. He wasn't just any defendant, but he wasn't treated as someone who mattered either. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, entered the room with the confident stride of someone who already knew the outcome. He wouldn't need evidence, just the officer's word. And with Judge Holloway in charge, that word carried more weight than any defense argument. When Calloway began presenting the case, Jamal listened to every word as if it were a memorized script. The officers described an aggressive suspect, a man who refused to obey legitimate orders and had to be restrained for their safety. No body camera, no witness, no radio record was presented, just their version. And as had happened so many times before, that version would be enough. Holloway listened with a distant look, occasionally glancing impatiently at the clock, as if all this were a waste of time. Jamal recognized that strategy. The faster the trial proceeded, the less time there would be for questioning. That was how a case was won, without needing to prove anything. Jamal remained still as the narrative against him unfolded in court. It didn't take much for him to understand what was happening. Calloway, the prosecutor, spoke with the assurance of someone who already had the decision in his pocket. He described a scenario where Jamal was the aggressor, where the officers were merely doing their duty in front of a man who, according to them, refused to cooperate. It was a theater, a well-rehearsed performance repeated countless times, only with different protagonists. And there was Judge Holloway, maintaining her rigid posture, listening with the bored look of someone who already had the gavel ready to strike. But then, it was Jamal's turn to speak. He stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, feeling the entire room waiting for his next move. He knew he had to be precise. He couldn't just shout his innocence or accuse the system of being rigged. That wouldn't work there. What worked was something much simpler. The facts. And he had them. "Your Honor," he began, looking directly at Holloway, "before we continue, I would like to present a necessary clarification." He reached into his jacket pocket, feeling the weight of his badge before taking it out and holding it up for everyone to see. "My name is Jamal Winslow. I'm a United States Assistant Attorney." The silence that followed was deafening. Calloway's confidence wavered. The officers stiffened, their eyes wide, their faces betraying surprise. But the most notable change came from Holloway herself. The boredom disappeared from her expression in an instant, replaced by something that seemed a mixture of irritation and caution. The game had changed. She knew it. Everyone there knew it. The revelation sent a palpable tension through the courtroom. Calloway opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, as if he knew that any argument he made from that point on could be dismantled in seconds. Jamal kept his badge visible, unhurried, letting everyone in the room absorb the impact of what that signified. He wasn't just another man pulled over late at night by officers who decided to manufacture a charge. He was part of the system, and for that reason, he couldn't be easily ignored. Then he played his final card. "Given my position and knowledge of the law, I would like to request that the radio records from the night of my arrest be immediately subpoenaed as evidence." The officer's reaction was almost imperceptible, but Jamal noticed. The slight hardening of expressions, the tension in their shoulders. They knew that if the records were examined, the sham would crumble. Holloway, who moments before had seemed eager to close the case, now found herself forced to reconsider. Allowing the case to proceed as any other would be too risky. And so before everyone, she had to do something she rarely did: hesitate. Jamal's request hung in the air like a silent threat. Judge Holloway, usually so quick to make decisions, now kept her lips pressed together, calculating what to do next. She knew that any attempt to ignore that request could backfire on her. The courtroom, once just another stage for automatic condemnations, was now under an invisible spotlight. Everyone was attentive, and if she denied the radio records, it would give Jamal exactly what he wanted: proof that the trial was a farce. Calloway tried to regain control. "Your Honor, there is no need for an unnecessary delay. We have the testimony of the officers, which is sufficient for—" He stopped mid-sentence, as if realizing the absurdity of what he was saying. The weight of Jamal's revelation was still sinking in. If he insisted, he might end up burying his own reputation along with the case. But Holloway, though reluctant, had no way out. With a heavy sigh, she struck the gavel on the bench. "The request will be granted. The hearing is suspended until the records are reviewed." It was at that moment that everything changed. What had once been just another lost case in the system, with no witnesses, no evidence, and no way out, now became a scandal about to explode. Journalists present in the courtroom began scribbling furiously. What had once seemed like a routine trial now took on a new dimension, and the officers knew it. Brent Kessler, the younger of the two, remained motionless, but Jamal noticed the sweat trickling down the side of his face. Kyle Driscoll, the one who had given the orders that night, maintained a stoic expression, but his hands were restless. They knew they had lost control of the narrative. The twist didn't stop there. As soon as the records were subpoenaed, the truth began to emerge. There was no communication mentioning a burned-out taillight, no request for a traffic stop, nothing that justified Jamal's arrest. What there was, however, was a revealing audio clip where one of the officers, unaware that the radio was on, casually said, "Let's give this guy a scare." The phrase dropped like a bomb in the courtroom. What had once been just a matter of conflicting versions was now a crime. Judge Holloway couldn't hide her irritation. She had been put in an impossible position. The case, which would have been resolved in minutes with a conviction, now threatened to become an investigation into police corruption. The media was already sniffing around something bigger, and her name was at the center of the storm. With no alternative, she was forced to drop the charges against Jamal and refer the case to the state attorney general. But for Jamal, that wasn't a victory. Not yet. He knew he was only free because he had a name and a position that protected him. The thought haunted him as he left the courtroom, and the question that wouldn't leave his mind was, how many others weren't so lucky? Out on the street, the hot and heavy air of Baton Rouge seemed different. The voices of reporters blended with the murmur of the crowd that was beginning to form in front of the courthouse. Jamal descended the steps slowly, feeling eyes on him. Some people held up makeshift signs, others recorded with their cell phones. The case that should have been just another statistic was now taking on a life of its own. People saw in him a representation of what happened every day, but which rarely received attention. And that was what bothered him. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted that never to have happened. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Messages and calls came non-stop. Colleagues from the Department of Justice, reporters, activists. Everyone wanted to know his side, wanted him to speak, to give a statement to the press, to denounce the system. But Jamal didn't want to become the face of a movement. He wanted justice. He wanted that case not to end only with his acquittal, but with real consequences for those who did this kind of thing every day. Only he knew that the system was a master at giving empty answers. A trial, a dismissal here and there, and then everything would go back to normal, just as it always did. It was then that he saw the officers being escorted out of the courtroom. Driscoll and Kessler kept their chins up, but their eyes avoided the camera flashes. They weren't under arrest yet, hadn't been formally charged, but the investigation was already underway. For the first time, they were on the other side. For the first time, they felt the weight of being exposed, of being judged. And for a moment, Jamal wondered if they were aware of what they had done. If at some point they had thought they could ruin his life for nothing. But he wasn't naive. He knew it wasn't about remorse, but about fear. Fear of what would come next. Fear of losing the protection that the system had always guaranteed them. And it was that fear that needed to be transformed into change. It wasn't enough for those two to fall. The problem was bigger than them. It was bigger than Holloway, bigger than Calloway. It was a cycle that had repeated for generations, sustained by a mechanism that ensured that few had a voice, while others exercised power without consequences. Jamal turned to the crowd. He still wasn't sure if he wanted to speak, but something inside him said he couldn't just walk away. He didn't want to be a symbol, but he also couldn't ignore what was happening. Because as much as his position had saved him, how many others weren't so lucky? How many others would continue to be silenced? And above all, how long would it take for this story to repeat itself? Jamal took a deep breath and climbed another step, facing the crowd. The cameras turned to him, the microphones were raised, and for a moment he wondered what he should say. He could simply thank them for the support. He could leave without saying anything. But looking at those faces, he realized that silence had never been an option for people like him. If the system wanted everything to go back to normal, he had the duty to ensure that it didn't. "I was exonerated today," he said, and his own voice sounded strange amid the murmur. "But not because the system wanted justice. I was exonerated because I was lucky, because I had a badge, because I'm someone they couldn't ignore." Silence took over the street. But what about the others? Those who don't hold an office, who don't have contacts, those who are forced to accept a false charge because they know no one will believe them. He paused, letting the question hang in the air. This isn't just about me. It was never just about me, and if we want change, we must ensure that this story never repeats itself, because I had an out. But how many others don't? Jamal descended the steps, feeling the eyes still upon him, but not wanting any more of the spotlight. He knew his name would be in headlines, that the case would have national repercussions. But he also knew that this wasn't a happy ending. It was merely a reminder that the system only reacts when forced. And even with all the attention that case was receiving, he knew it still wasn't enough. Because the next day, another man like him could be pulled over on the same street. He could hear the same words, suffer the same injustices, and the difference between living and being forgotten in the system would continue to be a simple matter of luck.